to the Omega Podcast. Welcome to the Omega Expert Chat with Landon Campbell, the Chicago General Manager of Drive Capital and host of the top business podcast in their 20s, and TEDx Speaker. Landon, we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Keenan. Excited to be here. Happy Saturday.
Yeah, happy Saturday. Landon, you started a trailblazing podcast that has featured some of our country's most well-known leaders in business. What inspired you to start in their 20s?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll even add world's most, famous leaders, because we had a prime minister from Haiti on the podcast a few months ago. So for background, I graduated from DePaul University in Chicago in 2020. So that was, the pandemic year when everything was ending, or we felt like the world was ending, I should say. We were in class for a little bit, and then we went to the home for remote, and then businesses shut down, and my friends were losing their job offers. It was a really crazy time. So just after seeing all that sadness, I decided to build a platform to empower my peers. And the best way that I felt I could do that was by interviewing current successful people about what they did in their 20s, a time when they probably didn't have things figured out, a time when they had to deal with some sort of uncertainty, a time when they had to push through to really create a strong and successful life for themselves. Because, life is not always so clear. And that's a message that I really try and share with my listeners and viewers. So we started with our professors and people that my co-host and I worked with, and then it quickly expanded to some really recognizable names.
That's incredible. I know for me, I was listening to some of the entrepreneurs and founders that you've recently spoke with, and I was just so inspired by the conversations that you were having, how you were really touching upon the key steps to starting a strong and successful business, which often many founders and entrepreneurs don't even take the time to assess. As you had those conversations with those entrepreneurs and leaders, what was one particular piece of advice that was shared with you that really resonated with you till today?
Well, on the subject of starting something, like starting a business or an entrepreneurial journey, a lot of people at times don't start based off of these ideas that they have because they're scared they're going to fail. So that's something that I've heard a lot of people on my podcast mention. You cannot fear failure. If you don't start a project or a company, or at least try something because you're scared, then you've ultimately already failed. So understand that not every project you start will become a unicorn, the big thing that changes the world. That's just reality. But you can learn so much from the lessons of failure that you can also learn from the lessons of winning. So I think that's really an important thing to recognize, where thinking about my own life, in their 20s was not the first thing I've ever started. It was maybe, I don't even know the number, maybe like 8 or 9 of things that I've started. And before all the other things, we're not talking about them anymore because a lot of failure, but it's okay. I've learned a lot from those experiences. And I was still willing to keep trying until something worked out, ultimately becoming in their 20s.
Absolutely. And being able to persevere through those downturns, through those tribulations, that's critical for any entrepreneur, any successful person, because we will hit roadblocks, right?
All the time.
All the time, exactly. And it's important to really assess new avenues, to be innovative, and to also pivot. It's okay if you realize that something that you're working on isn't going in the direction that you had wanted it to originally go in. It's good to understand that that's part of the learning process.
Exactly.
Yeah. How would you say entrepreneurs should be able to leverage their network?
Yeah, I think that before, especially as someone who works, in more of the venture capital space, so we give money in exchange for equity to entrepreneurs to help them form their businesses. I think that you never want to just wake up and say, okay, now I need money, from investors, or wake up and assume that these things will go your way. I think there's always there has to be a timeline that you put in place, days, weeks, months, before just building your network before you look to raise capital, before you look to do a lot of these other things when it comes to raising a business. So I guess the advice there is don't be in a rush for everything. Understand that this is a process, and you could be building relationships today that can really help a future company or a future ask, most importantly. But people just hate when you just walk up to them and you ask them for something, and it's very transactional, which I know happens a lot in the business world. But this was the whole reason I created a podcast. I've been building these relationships and friendships and mentors for now 2 years. And then when I've needed to ask for certain things, I've been able to do it in a much more efficient way. So any entrepreneur can do that, by creating a podcast, by, just speaking with people in the industry, or by providing value first before you ask for something else in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Developing key relationships is part of the process. I often get the question from, those that I work with that they would say that, hey, I'm an introvert. I struggle with socializing in group settings, or for instance, if I'm interested in, needing something particularly for my business, I have hesitancy in asking. And it kind of goes back to what you shared earlier with kind of getting over that hurdle of fear. You don't receive because you didn't ask, right? And it's important to have a strong rapport with folks that, you obviously want to work with in the future, but it's ultimately about understanding what are their particular values, what is their vision for their business, for their goals, and how can you sort of either understand what their missions are to see if you can align with it, or maybe if you realize, hey, this person is going in a different direction, then perhaps I'm probably going in career-wise, right, or professionally.
Exactly. No, very well said.
So learning how to navigate that's definitely something I noticed to be not easy for some, but for someone, who's starting in their 20s, or, early founders that might be hesitant to start networking, where should they start? Who should they perhaps start having these initial conversations with?
Yeah. So just first get a better understanding of like what area you're building in, or what area you want to break into, whether it's VC, media, tech, wherever it is, like really know the field. But then within that, you need to really know about the players in said field. And you could use resources like, of course, articles, but then also LinkedIn, just to see, okay, who are the top people in this field? But not only do you want to find ways to get to the top people, you also want to be able to talk to people who are like maybe 2 or 3 years older than you and who've been in that space and are currently doing well in that space. Because I think, yes, always great to go again for the people who have been there for a while, but you also want the perspective of the newer people. So yes, I'll use my example with venture capital. I both went after, top venture capitalists to hear about how they've continued to be successful in this field for a long time, but also building so many tight relationships with people 2 to 3 years older than me. Not the one, I guess one way to say it could be like, the ones that you want their job, but more importantly, again, like we can always all win. So just go for those people who are 2 to 3 years older than you in a position that, yes, you could see yourself being in. And those are both 2 types of people that would be really great people to get perspective from.
Yeah, seeking mentorship from folks that are older than you is, I think, in my opinion, the first step to really being a successful entrepreneur, because you're recognizing that you don't know it all, right? And you need guidance in order to successfully accomplish what you set out to do. What is your outlook on fostering a culture of inclusivity? As you probably have spoken to a recent podcast member about, they're developing their business, but it sometimes might be challenging to develop a culture as well, because you're so focused on your baby, right? Your business, your startup. And oftentimes founders later on realize that they should have been developing a culture, right? Of people that are going to be aligned with the mission or vision of the organization. What are some of the, initial steps, or maybe some advice that you've received on developing, cultures of inclusivity, developing strong brands earlier on?
Yeah, there are a few ways that you can do this. I think that the best leaders, first off, are always the last ones in the room to speak. So always put your people before yourself, and that includes your customers as well. But most importantly, again, like your employees too, and your team members. And then there's a mentality that I also have really taken. It's already existed, but I mean, I kind of try and brand it as my own, which is building in public. So building in public in tech, means just being vocal about your experiences, like what's happening underneath the hood. But I think that that's also a trait that you can have, as a leader as well. Building in public to me also means like being transparent with your workforce, understanding that you're not going to be perfect, with everything and know everything. But you need to be, vocal about letting people know that. So just being very transparent and open and honest, I think, are really recipes that can help, or ingredients that can build a great recipe of culture.
Yeah, transparency, developing those key conversations are so critical. And yeah, thank you so much for touching upon that, because if as leaders, if we're not being transparent, then we're kind of developing a culture of not being transparent, one, but also not on being honest, right? And I
Exactly.
think as we look to having stakeholders, or for instance stockholders, eventually, if you're
Mhm.
not transparent from the very beginning, how do you expect, down the line, when your business is 5-10 years in the market, and you're looking for that additional funding, right? People refer back to, is this a business that I can rely on? Do they have trust and integrity in the marketplace? And do I want to engage with what they're currently working on, right? And if we're
Mhm.
not touching upon all three cylinders, we're practically setting ourselves up for failure, which goes back to then having that fear, because you're not really focusing on the people, right? And that's really who we're serving, who we're providing our services or products for.
Yes. Yeah. Very well said.
Yeah. What particular, advice would you give perhaps a younger version of Landon? Now that you have accomplished so much in your career, and you're doing so many incredible things, and there's so much more in the future, what would you perhaps say to your younger self, probably starting as a freshman, prior to starting in their 20s, that perhaps now you now know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like every single year would be like something different,
Yeah.
like a different piece of advice that I'd give myself. But I'm very happy with where I am right now. This is my journey. What worked for someone else won't work for me, and that's completely fine. So there's no perfect life. So it's almost like I love this question, because if I had a time machine, you wouldn't really want to change much. But if I were to go back to my freshman year, since you did bring up that year. I think I was very worried about money my freshman year, and partially because like I had to help put myself through college, and yes, I needed money to survive. Um, but I think a lot of 20 somethings, there's just so much anxiety and thinking about, okay, like should I take this role versus this role, or no, I need to take this one because it's more money. And I'm just glad that like in my early to mid 20s now, like I've just stopped caring so much about it. Like it's not the main driver for what I do. Um, and when you have that click happen, then you just have opportunities to really pursue things that do make you feel special, and like things that like, and also you can take risks on. And it's easier said than done, obviously, and I think that it's difficult for some people to make that risk, because, money is something that, is we all need to survive, but I mean, some of us more than others, I feel like. But I sacrificed a lot of time, working hard in my college years so that I could launch a project like in their 20s. And even though I launched it while I was working full time, I still felt like I could take that risk, because, I was able to save up a lot, and also like put a lot of that money towards the podcast. So if you gotta, all I'm saying is that if you got to sacrifice a few years to then get to this level, and like being able to take a risk and do something that you're really passionate about, then you should totally go ahead and do that. And that's another thing I mentioned earlier, where you just don't expect this to happen overnight. Every overnight success that we see is like 10 years in the making. So understand that you always need a plan and a timeline, and just start to lay the building blocks early for something that you want to do in the future.
Yeah. And I love how you shared that even at the beginning of starting, we're also recognizing that it is a lot of sacrifice. It's a financial sacrifice, it's a time
Mhm.
sacrifice. You got to have to weigh the costs and benefits of what you could have been working on, vice versa. but it's important to recognize what is your passion, what is that you evaluate as your purpose, right? And this purpose was to develop this amazing podcast that has reached hundreds of millions of people over the past 2 years. So I think it's something that I'm so glad that you worked on, because I was, motivated, inspired by. And one of the original reasons why I reached out was because I think it's so important for people to have these open dialogues about what advice would help me, in this current season of life, to be able to be the most effective leader, the best person that I can be while I'm still learning and growing. So I think that that's incredible.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And we touched upon this earlier, regarding like financial understanding. And for some minority founders, women-owned businesses, that's a particular space that is not as accessible for some.
Sure.
What are some particular avenues would you probably discuss, or ways that early founders, early stage businesses could perhaps start looking into venture capital, or how should they approach some venture capital for firms if they're kind of in that status to do so?
Yeah, totally. I'm always for like founder leverage. So even though I work very, very early stage, and this new program I'm building out in Chicago, like we want to write, your first check, and we're going very, very early. I think, if you at least, as a founder have spent time, like a lot of time, thinking about the problem, you have a really good understanding of the market. You've maybe spoken to a lot of customers. You've built like a little, version of the thing, your product that you put out to people. It doesn't have to be perfect. That founder who's done all those things would at least be more appealing to me versus someone who hasn't done anything. So I think that you get leverage, and you get more access to a lot of these conversations and the potential to receive investment if you've done the work prior. So, that's another thing where, I feel that's a big theme of this interview, where people just, wake up and they have this idea and they see, okay, VC needs to be the first thing that I do. And just, if I were a founder, I wouldn't do that. No, this would be like, I'm not going to put a specific time on this, but, this could be weeks, months of planning, just to really dive in and understanding, what I'm looking to build. And then that is what I would, go into a VC with, or an angel investor with.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Yeah. Are there any final thoughts or any final questions, or anything that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I'd say, just if we've learned anything in the past 2 years, it's that no one really understands what's going on. So I can give all the advice in the world, but still, again, like what worked for me might not work for someone in the audience, and that's okay. But that's something that I built within their 20s. We have so much great advice from people, and I want listeners to just be able to pick and choose. Like, it's literally impossible to follow like what this guest did and what this guest did exactly. So life should be about, it's kind of like a game, like picking and choosing what works best for you. So I would say, again, two things with that. Be cautious of people who, pretend that they have everything figured out. I most certainly do not, and I don't think anybody does. We've really learned that from the past 2-3 years. But then also realize that, just take advice with a grain of salt, because it's really it's going to be your journey, and it's difficult at times to find someone who's gone through the exact same experience as you. There's commonalities, like you mentioned, women business owners earlier having difficulties, minority business owners finding difficulties to raise investment. Unfortunately, yes, that is something that I'm trying to fix. A lot of people are trying to fix, because that does happen, and that is a common thing. So yes, that's a piece that you should take advice with. But then you got to even take a step further and say, okay, like maybe this woman had this type of business in this industry, and then this woman had a different business in a different type of industry, and then like you're trying to break into a whole other industry, and then you're in a whole other city. Like, these are all kind of elements that you got to keep in mind. So I just hate like grouping people together and like kind of like putting the one brand, like, oh, it's like this for everybody. It's people have probably said that about me, but I mean, I've made stuff work as a young Black podcaster and who's now in venture capital. And I know it's been difficult, but my point is that everybody's journey is unique, and we can all get out there and get what we really want, but sometimes we just have to take a step back and really have a plan.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Landon, for being on the Omega Expert Chat.
Of course.